Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 137. It's just me today. Usually I have an interview, but today it just felt like I needed to share with you some thoughts that have been on my mind, and especially some highlights of my trip to England that I just recently returned from. I went to 2 weeks in Glastonbury. I stayed on a farm about 15 minutes outside of Glastonbury. Just to set it up, you guys hear me talking a lot about Mary Magdalene, and I think it can be confusing because I guess you kind of just assume when you're on a certain path and you're learning that maybe others have the same kind of understanding in some way, shape, or form. And so you sort of, it's really ridiculous, but you kind of forget that there's this whole vast, I guess you could say in a super nice way, ignorance about what happened to exclude the feminine for 2,000 plus years, even prior to earliest records. And our earliest archaeological finds were of these goddess statues, these figurines that have shown power and fertility and feminine creation. And so we know that literally those things were buried. And as we're continuing to excavate archaeologically, we're also finding hidden texts. And one of them did not come forth until World War II time. And some of you have heard of the Gnostic texts and are not quite sure, though, because it hasn't circulated mass consciousness, just because it can feel conflicting with certain religious orthodoxy, which is a paradox in and of itself, because orthodoxy and gnosis, or knowing, Gnostic, that's what it means. Gnostic means inner knowing. And so at the time these texts were buried is when the Roman Church was rising in power and empire, and was kind of conflating statehood and empire rule with religious practices and doctrines and knowledge. And so these texts that were circulating at that time, after the Council of Nicaea, or the Nicene Creed, in about 325 AD, it was decided which of those texts that were circulating, and there were many, we're going to make it into canonized scripture with what we know to be now the Holy Bible, and which were going to be driven into obscurity or burned, buried, destroyed. After that point, many of the documents that were circulating, one of which was the Gospel of Mary, which I'll talk about in a minute, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, they were deemed heretical after that council. So when I say there's kind of this vast ignorance of that, I mean, a lot of our structures are based on, a lot of our religious and even a lot of our academia are not kind of leaving out that whole picture of how there has been so much that's been suppressed. So much that has been suppressed in favor of building up the structures we have now that have grown to be vast and are really male dominated. And so that Nicene Creed was in fact male dominated. That Council of Nicaea was exclusively male, exclusively empire rule and priestly rule. And so anything that spoke of a feminine influence or goddess or power or female apostle or anything that put a woman in a position of wisdom or power was sort of driven out. In the 1940s somethings, late 1940s, these texts were discovered in Nag Hammadi, Upper Egypt. They're now known as the Gnostic Gospels. They were a major archaeological find, but at that point, all the major world religions were already established. And from a Christianity point of view, it created an interesting sort of tumult or angst within the academic community and the spiritual communities and religious structures, because they didn't know what to do with these. But they all corroborated each other. And I will tell you, just to kind of get to the heart of it, and there's so much research you could do on your own with the Gnostic Gospels, but I always thought when I was growing up that Gnostic was bad because I didn't know what it meant. I thought anything that wasn't, doctrine as I was told it was, that it couldn't be true. It couldn't be of God. It couldn't be of Christ. From a Christianity point of view, these Gnostic Gospels, this is the paradox that I was alluding to earlier. In the time that these texts were driven underground, there were two major camps, the Gnostics and the Orthodox. So we see that happening today. And now that these texts are being more talked about, that's where you see a rise in the knowledge and the interest, really, of the Magdalene, Mary Magdalene. It's not so much like her actual historical presence as much as it is her archetype. And an archetype, you hear me talking about this a lot because I'm a huge Carl Jungian depth psychologist person. I love studying how archetypes shape our current narratives and how they've shaped, the historical stories and the rhetoric that surfaces around the mainstream groupthink, really. But an archetype is just like a typical example of something, a certain person or a thing. So like you think of Joan of Arc. She was an actual historical figure, but she also represents a certain archetype of like a spiritual warrior. Mary Magdalene, I'll just read you this quote by Cynthia Bourgeois. And if you've never read her works, but she has a beautiful book called The Meaning of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Discovering the Woman at the Heart of Christianity. So just that byline alone, Discovering the Woman at the Heart of Christianity, this is what I'm talking about that has been erased, that has been excluded, that is now making a comeback. That, hey, guess what? This figure, the Magdalene, Mary Magdalene, she was the woman at the heart of the development of what we now have as Christianity. Sadly, though, 300 some years after her death, her teachings were buried, as were any evidences that she was an apostle, that she was right there with Christ. She was painted as a penitent whore for many years, that she was a prostitute. I still have many people talking to, when I bring up Mary Magdalene today, they're like, oh yeah, she was like, had a super colorful past and Christ cast 7 devils out of her. She must have been really bad, right? But actually those 7 devils were her 7 egos. And it was an ascension process that she was being cleansed and taught and mentored with Jesus and by Jesus. That's a lot of what was in the Gospel of Mary. Now, Mary Magdalene did not write the Gospel of Mary. And if any of you have studied religious texts, you know that none of the books of the New Testament were written by the actual names that are ascribed to them as authors, which we never learned in Sunday school. But like Matthew, Mark, Luke, the 4 Gospels, those were not written by those apostles. They were written by scribes based on the witnesses or the teachings, the lens or perspective of that particular apostle. And they weren't even really recorded to be disseminated until about 70 or 80 years after Christ's death. So that just gives you a little perspective. So Mary Magdalene, her teachings were after the crucifixion. It's believed that she went over to Europe, that she traveled to Egypt and Europe, particularly France. There's a lot there. And some of you know that I've talked about my sacred pilgrimage there to retrace her steps. She disseminated these teachings, which are called the Way or the Way of Love, which were the heart of Christ's teachings. The other Gnostic Gospels share or corroborate that she was doing that, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip and the Pistis Sophia. These are all Gnostic texts that separately validate the fact that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a very close discipleship, partnership, possibly marriage, but at the very least, she was considered the apostle to the apostles because of the depth teachings that he was disseminating to her. So in terms of an archetype, I'll just read this again by Cynthia Bourgeois. Kind of went off on a tangent, sorry. She said, yes, she is an apostolic leader, but not only this. Yes, she is a beloved, but not only this. Yes, she is a feminine archetype, but not only this. Flesh and blood, human being, beloved teacher, spiritual master in her own right. All of these dimensions have come together to reveal who she really is and the enormity of the gift she has to bring to us. You could say Mary Magdalene's archetype and the knowledge to know more about her is making a huge comeback in the consciousness right now, especially for Christians, because of what she represents. A lot of people, and this is the path that I've kind of followed, is trying to understand, what is a modern day priestess? And like in my religion of origin, Mormonism, that word is given to us in sacred settings, but we're not told what it actually is. And the reason I started on this divine feminine path, and I talked to many women of all religions, and they're all saying the same thing. Like, what is it? What does it mean to be a goddess? What does it mean to be a priestess? But the reason I started on the path of studying the divine feminine is because that word had a divine spark charge for me. I wanted to understand what it was. And it has taken me literally all over the world. And one of the reasons I went to England, we had a whole year's mystery school path with a great teacher facilitating and guiding. She's an amazing, beautiful teacher of helping us come to understand the way of the priestess and what that means for us personally. And the beauty of it is that the way of the priestess, if it calls to you, is not a one size fits all. It's not hierarchical. It's not a checklisted thing. It doesn't have requirements. Mary Magdalene, I would say one of the strongest aspects to her archetype for me has been that she was there anointing Christ, literally before his crucifixion. She had an alabaster jar. She was doing specific ritualistic things. You can read a lot of history and research on this. Biblical scholars agree, as do historical theologians and academics from many walks of life who have studied priestess rituals during that era, that she was definitely doing a priestess ritual, and that she would have been influenced by, for sure, the legacy of the goddess temples and some of the rituals that they were doing in these goddess temples that were removed, for some of the wisdom keepers that still held some of those teachings. And then also, like with Egyptian mystery schools and India, we don't know where she traveled and if she was a companion of Christ prior to his ministry that we know of in the Bible. His ministry doesn't even start till he's 33 years old. So we have his 12th year to this 33rd year where we just it's a mystery. But many believe that Jesus traveled to ancient Britain and some of the trade routes through there and did so with Joseph of Arimathea, who Joseph of Arimathea was a very wealthy benefactor of Christ and would have had the means to take him to some of these places like Egypt, India, ancient Britain, and even ancient France, which was then known as Gaul, Gaul, to learn, to prepare for his mission, to see what was, some of the wisdom teachings throughout the world. And it makes sense to me, if he's the Christ of the world, that he would have known these things and had the means to travel to these places, and that would have been set up for him. And Mary Magdalene, one of the other reasons that I find her archetype so powerful is that she had a title. She was Mary of Magdala, and she came from a wealthy family, and she could have been one of Jesus's benefactresses and had the means also to travel and be educated. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that's one of the reasons that brought me to Europe just recently. The region there that's, it abounds in myths and legends. And for me, it's not necessarily, are they literally true? Like, is it literally true that Jesus and Mary Magdalene came to Europe, or that they would have traveled there, prior to Jesus's ministry? If you go to these regions, like where I was in Avalon, Glastonbury area, there's not only the legends of King Arthur and Guinevere, but it definitely archetypally mirrors Jesus and Mary Magdalene and their connection. And it's just the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. That area where I was at Chalice Gardens and Chalice Well is an area on the earth that is so pure and sacred, because you have the white springs and the red springs and these beautiful legends and myths that come forward about Avalon, and even the way of the priestess, the way of alchemizing the red and the white, or the pure and the sacred with the human. For me, it was just such a culminating journey in that, because there are so many legends about Mary Magdalene there. Like I said, I don't literally ascribe to it, but what matters to me is that I'm learning from this archetype. I'm following in these and tracing these footsteps and climbing the Tor, which is Tor, which is the top of Glastonbury, which is a beautiful tower that has all of this mystery. And for me, it was kind of analogous as I'm climbing. It was my second time there. First went there in late 2018. For me, it was just this guided inner process of alchemizing the sacred masculine and the feminine within me, and understanding what the way of the priestess is for me, for Cherie. So I wanted to share some of those thoughts with you. For me, one of the most compelling things about the rise of, Mary Magdalene's archetype, and people hungering to know more about her, and what does she actually represent, and how close was she actually to Jesus, and, how does that impact the beliefs that we hold today, and what do we see happening with some of these old established traditions of the fathers, quote unquote, and how can bringing this woman who was at literally the heart of Christianity before it was even Christianity, before it was even formed into a church, the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, Jesus and Mary Magdalene together, teaching people about the way. Myself, along with many other spiritual truth seekers, and I guess you could say thought leaders, those who aspire to be a messenger of this way, it's a very soul-based surrendering. It's kind of like emptying and surrendering to God the Mother and God the Father, coming to still point within through a dedicated, regular spiritual practice. And I will be honest, having a devotional practice is something I resist because I am so busy. But what I love about the things I've learned through the Gospel of Mary, a lot of the Gnostic texts, and of course the canonized scripture that we do have, is that this ability to come to the kingdom within, and I also call it the queendom within, it makes you a temple keeper. You hold this womb wisdom and these ancient sacred feminine mysteries inside of you. They're already there. They're in your spiritual DNA. So all you have to do, make it sound so simple. Yeah, all you have to do, the task, the practice is to soften and open so that you can start remembering these things and allowing them to unfold within you. So a lot of times, this is why Mary Magdalene feels familiar to people. It's because of what she's teaching and representing. Integrity to that divine voice within. Holding your ego power at bay. For me, it's been doing a lot of shadow work and looking at what is my relationship to false power? What is my relationship to flawed authority? Why do these things trigger me so much? So yeah, this is kind of the precursor to claiming your integrity, your integral inner authority. And that's the thing that I find, again, so extremely powerful about the Magdalene path. It is the path to sovereignty and inner authority. It's about claiming your own wisdom, being the temple keeper or the priestess of the queendom and kingdom within, and allowing these ancient feminine mysteries to start to unfold and you start to remember. And we happen to live in a world where this is not easy. We live in a world that has a lot of distraction and heaviness that's like gravity, like pulling us down to fear-based and lots of illusion, lots of fear-based illusion. So this Magdalene path is about being boundaried, having such sacred boundaries and being self-contained, like preserving your own power and allowing what you've received, like grace, to just flow through you. You're able to source that power from within. I mean, yes, grace is always there, but you have to source it. It's a gift outside of you. Yes. Also, you have to allow it. This path, the Magdalene path, the way of the priestess, it's not about placating or people pleasing or status quo stuff just to keep power structures where they're at. It's kind of a whistleblower type thing. It could be, depending on your personality. For me, I've decided I like to stir things up, and I'm not doing it in a way to be rebellious. It's just in my nature. I'm like going to poke at things. I'm going to look at what's under the surface. I'm going to ask questions. And I used to be shamed for that, for not just accepting things the way that they are. When I listened to the voice within and I learned how to access stillness in the most pure sacred regions of my heart, I started to feel this stream of God, this power straight from the source. And that's all I needed. And I realized that it was now my practice or my mastery to continue to give myself that permission. The other part of the Mary Magdalene and way of the priestess is being fully embodied. And I get asked, because I say this a lot on my podcast, you guys always hear me talking about being embodied. Some people resist. They're like, well, yeah, I'm in my body. No, actually, you have to pull pieces of yourself back together because you've been fractured and people have told you certain things about yourself that you might have believed. And so you've buried pieces of yourself. That wild woman archetype, a lot of us have really buried. We haven't allowed ourselves to be free, truly free. So fully embodied is knowing who you are and who you trust. Trusting yourself is part of it, trusting the voice within, but it's just the steadfastness in your own knowing. It's like, I know who I am and no one can take this from me. No one. Mary Magdalene's gospel talks about the anthropos, which is being fully human and fully divine. So when we relate that to the way of the priestess, and this is where religions kind of miss the mark because they don't allow our humanness. They want us to bypass over our humanity. And I don't mean our generosity and prosperity and all the good things about our humanity. I mean all of the messy aspects of who we are. Our body is not our enemy. We are not vehicles of temptation in this body as women. Eve did not, take the apple and be responsible for the downfall of humanity and all these old paradigms. We embrace that duality. We embrace that messiness. And this is what I mean about Chalice Well with the red and the white. We are fully human in our redness, in our fire, passion, anger, fury, whatever that real, raw humanity is. And we are also fully divine, white, pure, sacred. You cannot ever take that divine femininity from yourself, that whiteness. You cannot ever, and I hate to be bashing on religion, but I'm really clear now that this is one of the ways we become traumatized. We receive these messages that our body is evil, that we are vehicles of temptation, that our messiness is keeping us from God. As I like to say, your mess is your message. You need to be fully human in order to walk the planet. And that's what being fully embodied means. It's embracing your wholeness, every aspect of yourself, and claiming who you are in your body. So we fragment from that divinity within, that white part of us, that pure part of us, when we bypass over our humanness. So a fully embodied woman and man, they don't spiritually bypass over their human messiness. They claim it and they work with it. And this is where your trauma can come up, and this is where the blood, sweat, and tears can happen. This is where, we beat ourselves up over yelling at our kids or whatever it is, our past mistakes. In saying that we're embracing our full humanity, that is not to say we are reveling in all of our ways we've missed the mark, which is all that sinning really is. This literally means missing the mark. We actually err more on the side of mercy, compassion, love. So this way of the priestess is being fully embodied with love. Love for your own humanity, your own body, your own DNA, your own inheritance, your own humanness, your messiness, and being fully embodied in your divinity. So there isn't any structure or organization or person who can take away your connection to God, that divinity. Your connection to God the Mother and God the Father, whatever those constructs are for you. For me, it lands in there is a mother and a father. I don't completely understand the mystery of what that is, but all I know is that I am in a human body and I need a mother and a father. The mediator was Christ, right? He was fully in his body. He had all of these experiences. He was able to work miracles. He was able to ascend and resurrect. And right beside him was this woman. And she has really, Mary Magdalene, and she has really gotten the brunt end, honestly, of her leadership was just diminished by the Roman papacy. And she hasn't been able to be fully expressed in what her path was until now. So many of us are starting to speak out about her because it's just so undeniable when you look at the history. Another thing about Mary Magdalene and the way of the priestess is she speaks truth to power. She's a voice for the voiceless. What does that mean? It means that she does not shut down her voice and her knowing in favor of keeping the status quo. She stood up to the establishments in her time, as did Christ. The other piece of this is being connected to nature and the rhythms of nature. Have you guys noticed there's a comeback? People are interested in astrology. People are interested in the phases of the moon. They know that it affects their feminine body. They know that the things that are happening on the earth are just a mirror of what's happening in the consciousness, and the earth is trying to bring us back to stillness, to the temple within. So the way of the priestess is being in her body, connected to her body and the body of the earth, mother, the rhythms of nature, and what her relationship is to that. It's not about earth worship. This is where this paganistic stuff gets a bad rap. Paganism, actually, all the way back, was heretical because it involved something outside of an establishment. It involved honoring nature and cycles and earth medicine and really ancient feminine arts. They became paganistic. Not to say that there wasn't crazy stuff going on back then, just as there is today. But the sacred part of that got muddied. It became heretical. It became, women can't do that. Women have to fall into this structure, this way, these boundaries. So this rising we see now, it's still that same battle between the Gnostics and the Orthodox, between the people who are super rule bound and literal and black and white, and this is the way it is, and this is what God wants you to do, and the Gnostic or the gnosis or the knowing or the being in your body, listening to the voice within, being that sacred temple keeper. I guess the final part of this path of the Magdalene, or way of the priestess, is that she knows how to create. There's a term creatrix that I really love. And in future podcast episode, we'll talk about creatrix. But she births things, whether or not she gives birth to humans. The way the priestess is able to give life. She's a life giver. She's a mother, not just to children, but to herself, to the earth, to animals, the plant kingdom, and so forth. And she nourishes and nurtures. One of the things that drew me to Glastonbury is I had heard, that there was just this beautiful energy there of the sacred alchemy between the white and the red springs and all the history of the Chalice Well. And you guys can go Google that. There's so much about it. It's very mystical, but it's also quite profound when you experience it yourself. And as I said, that was my second trip there. What I was really filling into is the garden, the Chalice Well garden. I have heard it taught that it's a metaphor for transformation. One of the teachers that I've followed for quite some time is Dr. Jean Houston. She wrote a book, and I'll try to remember the name of it, but it was about the Odyssey. She was talking about giving new meaning to really Homer's Odyssey, which is a story from 3,000 years ago. And it serves as a metaphor for humanity in our world today. It's kind of like the hero's journey I talk a lot about this king who is trying to return home and his beloved Penelope after the Trojan War. And he was guided by this magic, this wayfinder Hermes, and the wisdom of the goddess Athena. So it's all this Greek mythology. The way Jean Houston moved the story through, Odysseus's warrior pride, that sensitive male, went through the initiation of the goddess. So that was kind of me. I'm like, okay, I know I've built up all this hardness because I've lived in the world and I've had to survive here. I've walled off my heart in some respects. I'm going into the Chalice experience with the intention of re-alchemizing the red and the white within me, and how I've let these hardness or these hard structures kind of build up in me. And it's not just with ego, but like trauma and building up walls. And how do I let things flow like these springs? Becoming human in the garden, breaking down everything is like making compost. How we need a lot of compost to grow something new. It's a new dream. It's all these old ancient archetypes, these metaphors, these tales, that are coming forward to reclaim that beauty and that metaphor for planting a garden of new humanity, really. What I see is for those of us who are feeling called to be way showers in the new paradigm, it's because we've realized we can no longer live in these archaic forms that we've been living in. We have to take our place, claim our own inner authority, get the divine go-ahead first, right? Feel that grace moving in you, connect to that kingdom, queendom within that Jesus talked about, and then resource your deep humanity. And this is the sweet spot of how your garden blooms, how you grow, how you work with the metaphorical soil of this new earth. We've entered that whole era of deep forgetfulness, forgetting who we are, forgetting our own inner authority, our own power. Deferring to outside structures, like I talked about, placating and people pleasing. Women have done that for so long, and they've had it. We get to, come back to nature, come back to the higher mysteries of life, whatever those archetypes are for you, whether it's Mary Magdalene, or there will be something, some archetype or something that speaks to you that, and maybe many. I have definitely got more than Mary Magdalene. Something will strike at the heart of you and you can't ignore it anymore. So I took this journey to Glastonbury this last time, right in the middle of COVID. I had to take 5 or 6 COVID tests just to get there and be there and come back. Of course, they're all negative. I just wanted to go on this personal journey. I knew I had to go. I had to meet up with my feminine mystic soul sisters that have been on this journey with me for a year. I was pretty much the only American there. My friend Amber tagged along as well. She hadn't been on the year path with me, but she was there staying with me in Glastonbury on the farm writing. Taking this path, returning to these sacred wells, seeing people come from all over the world really, and just pouring their hearts. Some of them were singing and chanting. Some of them were weeping and praying. To me, it was an actual metaphor of the journey of the soul, weaving all the processes and experiences and stories from my journey, which I was actually writing about. And I will have my book coming out in 2022 about Mary Magdalene and my path with her and finding her, how she found me, really. But we are the Odysseus. We are the hero or the heroine of our own story. And we can live these mythic lives. Myth is powerful. Archetypes and myths are powerful. It's not literal. When we talk about moving onto a spiritual path, you have to have your own heroes. There were people who came before you, whether they were fictional or literal. These stories live in the consciousness, and they can propel us and move us into higher ways of being. I write a lot and talk a lot about the heroine's journey. I've interviewed Maureen Murdoch on this, who wrote the heroine's journey 30 years ago. But it's time to claim our red, our humanity. And Mary Magdalene is often associated with the color red. There's a lot there. Yeah, so I just wanted to share with you guys that I felt really strongly to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what this is. Who was Mary Magdalene? Why am I really tuned in and focused on writing about her, studying about her, researching? How does her path mirror mine? And this priestess, what is this? What is the way of the priestess? What is the quote unquote way that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were teaching that we now know through these Gnostic texts that definitely back up and support our biblical stories, but actually give us more of those stories, give us more of what was happening, different perspectives. I'm really mindful now of coming back to the garden metaphor and me being in Chalice Wells in the garden and climbing the tour and just being really immersed in these red and white springs and feeling the purity. Literally, I stood over the white well. Again, this is like a world famous place, and I'd read about it. Last time I was in Glastonbury, didn't get to go to the Chalice Well. This time I did. And when I stood over the well, I just really tuned into my body, and I just really breathed into why am I really here? And if any of you can relate to this, how your red parts of you, your humanity, your fire, your passion, your spontaneity, your spunk, your fire, your wild side, your messiness, you might be holding shame that literally creates a block in you. And there's nothing like water to give us that beautiful metaphor of just things flowing and moving. And that's how energy in the body works. If you have something stuck, blocked, it's just because the energy is not able to flow. So I put my hands over my womb space, which is a second chakra, which is where we hold a lot of our trauma as women, generationally as well as personally. I was able to feel purity, probably for the first time that I can remember, to be honest. Probably from since I was a child, or would have even thought about it. And I don't think it was just the magic of that place. I think it's just that I had, taken the time out of my busy life schedule, COVID, expense, time, travel, being away from my family, super uber spiritual journey energy behind it. But I knew that somehow this land and God was making themselves known to me in that moment for my sacrifice to be there. So it was my own moment of just feeling my own sacredness and letting those rivers flow, those white springs, that white divine part of me more freely. So the red and the white together is the color pink. So we all had a pink rose. We all had our own experience around what that means for us. I guess one of the reasons that I feel so compelled to share some of the experiences that I have had and the realizations in history and research that I've compiled is because I want to normalize or bring to more mass awareness in just my little sphere that it's time for us to step into worthiness, purity, power in that purity, releasing the self-abnegation and replacing it with radical self-compassion. No more self-flagellation. I made a commitment to myself. And also knowing that it would come up again, that it was part of my life's work to continually bring in this beautiful, white, pure feeling that source within me, not outside of me, whenever I would have those competing thoughts, the inner critic. Just for me, it really boils down to the way of the priestess is just about emptying and surrendering to God the Mother, God the Father. Our organic feminine and masculine references for that, I believe, are Jesus and Mary Magdalene together. And if you study the Gospel of Mary and most of the Gnostic texts, they talk about coming into that still point through a process. That ascension happens from within. It has nothing to do with the power structures around you, leaders around you, parents, spiritual leaders, teachers, in any way, shape, or form. It's no guru, as Christ taught. He employs no servant at the gate, I believe is the biblical reference for that. So This new way is not a new way of the priestess. It's actually an ancient force, energy, practice, archetype. It's a real power that's starting to come forward and it's going to make a more mass debut as more and more people awaken. I would guess that a lot of you might be drawn to learn more about this because you have a path with this as well. And if Mary Magdalene is not your person or your archetype that you would attach to as a way shower or who embodies what you want to create, be in this world, then find one, and find one that has stayed in integrity with their own knowing. Joan of Arc's a good one, actually, that stood up and spoke truth to power, that listened to angels and the voice within and didn't listen to cultural norms or spiritual teachers around her. She listened directly to source. And that is the way of the modern priestess. That is the ancient way of the feminine. Thank you for listening to this long diatribe. I feel like there will be more coming. Definitely writing about this. Definitely in the thick of writing about my story. There were a lot of things that happened in England that let me know everything had led to that alchemy or sacred marriage within of the red and white, the masculine and the feminine, this pink space in between of doing this my way. And so my programs, my teachings, some of the offerings that I have coming forward will be to help you, if you choose to guide you into your own reclamation of the white and the red, to embrace all of you, because those are the teachers that we need on this planet. Those are the way showers that we need, are those who have been able to access their own wisdom without ego and showing up to help heal this world and being in the right headspace and energy to do that, cultivating and working with your own shadow side so that you don't spiritually bypass over what's messy or dark, but you work with it and hold it and love it. Love yourself into your own reformation, your own transformation, your own resurrection, your own rite of passage into the new earth and the new you. So anyway, yes, I'm still in formulating here, but I've had some major realizations and downloads, if you will, on what I want to offer. And so that will be forthcoming as I continue to cull and refine what those offers are. But in the meantime, just have a glorious week. And remember that you have the power within you. And you have the sacredness. You have the power within you to create absolutely anything that you desire. And when your heart is purified and you know in whose service you are in, which is to all of humanity and to the divine, that anthropos, then you will start to feel more and more alive. And you will start to have realizations and rememberings about why you are on earth right now. So with that, I will leave you. And we will talk to you next time on Women Seeking Wholeness.